It is truly a privilege and a pleasure to introduce our guest for this evening. Wilfred M. McClay has been the SunTrust Bank Chair of Excellence in Humanities at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga since 1999. He is also a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, and a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. Since 2002, he has been a member of the National Council for the Humanities, which is the advisory board for the National Endowment for the Humanities. His books include The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, The Student's Guide to U.S. History, Religion Returns to the Public Square, and Figures in the Carpet, Finding the Human Person in the American Past. Tonight, Dr. McClay will be speaking on the topic of Patriotism in the American Experiment, the Use and Abuse of History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McClay.
Thank you. Ben neglected to mention that I know his brother. So that's another credential I bring to his brother Tim. Wow, Kelly, I wish I could be worthy of that introduction. I think I'm going to put a bumper sticker on my car saying, I want to be the person that Kelly Hanlon says I am. But I also, you really, when you're describing my work, you really did get at what I try to do. And so that part of it was particularly humbling and gratifying at the same time. So thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you and to associate myself in an early stage of its development with the Agora Institute and its aims. And I do have to say, you people have no idea what a dynamo, but you're about to find out in the years to come what a dynamo you have in Kelly Hanlon. She's just a great person. I've known her for, what have we known her? About 8 years or so. And she's one of the people that the better you get to know her, the more you admire her. And I can't think of many people like that. My wife, in fact, is the only person that fits that category. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to associate myself with the goals of this organization, one of which surely is renewed attention and revitalization of our legacy, of the way in which we pass on to subsequent generations what we are, what we stand for, what we aspire to be, the ideas and institutions that make America what it is, at least to make America what it is in the best ways. Now, the past 30 years or so particularly have seen a lot of attention to these kinds of things, and I'm in particular going to focus on the field of American history because it's my specialty, the discipline in which I was trained at the graduate level. But it really applies to all of these legacy issues. I think a key moment came in 1983 when the Presidential Commission on education, on the state of education, came out with a report called "A Nation at Risk: The Imperative for Educational Reform." And this was a report that painted a rather dire picture of American education, and it compared famously the effects of the educational system to the effects of an enemy invasion. That if we had imagined this educational system as being propagated by an enemy of the United States, it could hardly have been worse. This was a presidential commission. So the need was obvious, the diagnosis was very dire. Why has so little been done in the last 30 years or so to reform, and here I particularly want to talk about history, but to reform education in general? Why has it turned out to be such a slow and seemingly intractable process? We really haven't made any progress in substantially improving young people's knowledge of American history in the decades since the publication of A Nation at Risk. This is confirmed by all serious quantitative measures, comparative scores on standardized tests, There has been some limited success in establishing history standards in various states, although in many cases these standards are not very helpful and easily manipulated or gotten around. I find more impressive, this tells you something about me, I suppose, the impressionistic evidence, but from seasoned observers who go around to college campuses. The historian David McCullough, for example, a very genial man who's not given to pronouncements of doom or culture wars or Jeremiads or anything like that. He said not long ago that in 3 decades of lecturing on colleges and universities, he's seen a steady decline in the historical sense of students. And I quote, "I don't think there's any question whatsoever that the students in our institutions of higher learning have less grasp, less understanding, less knowledge of American history than ever before." It hasn't improved since he made that statement. And in some ways, the condition is even more despair-inducing in the primary and secondary levels, which may be even more impermeable to reform. Not only do students lack what might be called the cultural literacy regarding the facts of American history, but they're almost completely lacking in what I call and others call historical consciousness. That is, an awareness that the past is something real, that it informs in a very, very genuine way the world that we live in. It shapes who we are, where we stand today, where we're likely to stand tomorrow, and that it is a resource to draw upon. It is central to our very identity. And we draw on this resource especially in times of trouble and uncertainty, which I think describes our own time pretty well. This is partly a failure of imagination, but it also reflects other more basic failures. I won't rehearse all of this quantitative material because you've heard it all. The NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Program scores, generally downward since the early 90s. The study that has impressed me the most, and it's over 10 years old now, but I think nothing has changed. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni, ACTA, did a survey. It was actually carried out by the Roper Group called Losing America's Memory. And it was a study of graduating seniors at the 55 most selective colleges in America and reflected abysmal ignorance of history. And this, I think, is especially alarming. It's bad enough when kids at average schools, don't know, for example, what decade the Civil War was fought in, or who the Revolutionary War was fought against. But when graduates of Harvard, Williams, Pomona, Chicago, Princeton, and the like are not in full possession of these kinds of fundamental facts, then it's safe to assume that almost nobody is in that generation. And there will be very few people to pass on this knowledge to the next generation. And by the way, ACTA did a follow-up study that indicated the colleges had done nothing to rectify this situation in the years after the report. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but certainly we're not doing the right things to turn the situation around. That much is clear. It was heartening when Senator Robert Byrd, the late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, reacted to the ACTA report by one of his fits of outrage, which led him to do what he did best, throw money at the problem. So he appropriated large sums of money for a program administered through the Department of Education in courses in history. And he instituted something called Constitution Day to be celebrated September 17th of every year by every institution that received federal funds, which is just about all of them, if you include student loans and such. So, but this has had almost no effect. All of these programs, and Constitution Day is barely noticed. Many schools celebrate Constitution Day by putting an old book in a glass case in front of the library. and that's their observance. So we're in the parlous state, and I think when one's in a parlous state, the best thing to do is not to wave your hands and scream and run around in a circle, but to think back to origins, to think back to first principles. And I think one of the ways we can do that with respect to history is to reflect on history as a form of memory, which is precisely what the title of the ACTA Study, Losing America's Memory, invites us to do. This is a very common metaphor, but we often don't think about our metaphors, as George Orwell points out, and think about what they really mean, if they're living metaphors or not. And often they mean a lot more than we give them credit for meaning. The impulse to do history, as we say in the field, to write history, to think historically, seems to be intrinsic to us as human beings. We are remembering and storytelling creatures. It's in our nature. Not just Southerners, we all do it. What we call history is merely the intensification of this basic human impulse to tell stories and to remember through the telling of stories. But the cultivation of this is essential to the perpetuation of civilized life. Historical consciousness is to civilized society what memory is to individual identity. Without memory, without the stories in which memories are suspended, we can't say who or what we are. We can't learn, we can't use language, pass on knowledge, raise children, establish rules of conduct, or even dwell together in society. Nor do we have a sense of the future as a time that we know will come because we know other futures have come. We remember that fact. A culture without memory will necessarily be barbarous and easily tyrannized, even if it's very technologically advanced, because the drumbeat of daily events will drown out all of our efforts to connect the past, the present, and the future. So memory is a crucial source of continuity. You don't have to be a conservative to believe this. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is not my definition of a conservative, said, "Memory is the cement, the bitumen, the matrix in which all the other faculties are embedded. Without it, all of life and thought is an unrelated succession." But something more needs to be said. We don't acquire a life-enhancing memory or a lively historical consciousness through the mere piling up of facts. It's not as if the more facts you know about the past, the better off you are. That's one reason that the ACTA study actually understates the depth of the problem, because it's not enough to know what decade the Civil War occurred in. It might make you a better Jeopardy contestant, but that's about the extent of it. No, memory is the most powerful when it is purposeful and selective. Memory requires a grid, a pattern of organization or a structure within which the facts arrange themselves in meaningful patterns. Above all, it requires the stories and narratives that link facts in ways that are both meaningful and truthful. That's the principle of selection, a way of knowing what facts are worth paying attention to and what ones are not. That's how we remember the most meaningful things. Otherwise, by just thinking of history as a succession of facts, we fall into the famous description of history offered by that great anti-philosopher of history, Henry Ford. History, he said, is one damn thing after another. Which I've always thought was a great unused resource for Calvinist historians. Let me offer an illustration of what I'm talking about that comes from a fine book, not an easy read, David Schenk's book called The Forgetting, which is about Alzheimer's disease. But it actually is also, even though he doesn't really mean it to be, a sustained meditation on the meaning of memory and thereby of history. The book is actually worth talking about at length, but what I'm going to do is steal one anecdote from it that is perfectly suited to my purposes. It's a story he tells, and see, I'm telling a story. story he tells of a case study of a man whom psychologists call S. You know, they always have to keep the identity secret. S was a Russian journalist. He is described thus. He remembered every detail of sight and sound that he had come into contact with in his entire life. This freakish talent emerged when he was in an editorial meeting and the editor reprimanded him for not paying attention and taking notes, at which point S proceeded to repeat back to the editor every word that had been spoken in the meeting. At that point, the editor was impressed, sent S to the distinguished psychologist A.R. Luria, who subjected him to a battery of tests and concluded, yes, it's true. There's no limit to what this guy can recall. He could memorize lengthy tables of random numbers in an instant, recall them perfectly for years to come. He seemed to literally remember everything. And yet, Schenck, the author, says, he understood almost nothing because he could not make meaning out of what he saw. When he was presented, and there's a few examples here, he presented with tables of numbers placed in a deliberate and obvious pattern, even a standard ordinal sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. He couldn't make out the pattern. He couldn't understand poetry because poetry requires the understanding of the figurative use of language. He couldn't understand the law because the law is meaningful only in its relationship to particular applications. He couldn't even remember people's faces very well because facial expressions change. And he lacked the ability to generalize the look of a smiling and a frowning person into one stable identity. He was disorganized, as you can imagine, and many people thought he was stupid. And Schenck concludes this way: this astounding man then was not so much gifted with the ability to remember everything as he was cursed with the inability to forget detail and form more general impressions. He recorded only information and was bereft of the essential ability to draw meaning out of events. For him, life was indeed one damn thing after another. As this case illustrates, what makes for genuinely intelligent and insightful memory is not just the capacity for retention. It's a certain balance in the mental economy of remembering and forgetting. In other words, memory takes an active role in thinning out the mental trees so the forests can be discerned. It's selective by nature, and its selectivity is essential for it to do its work in creating rational order. This selectivity is reflected in the etymology of the Greek word logos, which is variously translated. I feel embarrassed with Mark Schiffman here talking about logos, but I'm going to do it anyway. Variously translated as word, account, argument, and several other things. And it comes from the verb legein, that's the infinitive, meaning to select. So the word that makes up our word logic, it comes from this notion of selectivity. And that is at the root, its etymological root of it. We remember the things that select out what is essential and fit it into a template of meaning. We fail to retain the details that, like wandering orphans, are of no abiding concern to us. So the high intelligence at work is not the same thing as total recall. It's closer to being the opposite of total recall, selective recall. My mother always used to accuse me of selective hearing. So I think I showed my intelligence in that regard. All right, well, what are the practical implications of these observations for this teaching and study of American history? Let me suggest 3 for starters. First, the movement towards the emphasis on content in historical instruction, which is a very good thing, something I endorse entirely, but it needs to be augmented by a greater concern with the form in which the content appears. We shouldn't feel we're doing a better job just because we're saddling kids with big, giant, biceps-building required textbooks that have all the names, dates, concepts, documents, and everything between 2 covers. there's no reason to believe anybody will remember anything from all of that, unless the books do what textbooks almost by definition fail to do, and that is to provide a compelling, coherent narrative account within which the factoids can start to make some sense. So textbooks, I'm actually ferociously opposed to textbooks. I did a little book that I think Kelly mentioned in the introduction called The Student's Guide to U.S. History, and I do not recommend a textbook in it. I get mail all the time from this book. And I would say 3 of 4 messages I get say, why didn't you include a textbook? I now think I should have had why I don't recommend a textbook section in the book. I think instruction in history would be vastly improved if we banned the typical American textbook with all of its false omniscience and phony neutrality, confused narrative live jumble of facts, endless sidebars and jazzy graphics and all of that. And in its place had students read real books by real authors with a real point of view and a real style and a story to tell. These books do a far better job of stimulating the imagination, and they embody the selectivity that is important to the formation of durable memory. That's what we need to do if we want our kids to cherish American history. Second is the notion that we can, and this is actually fading somewhat, but there's still the notion out there that we can finesse the problem of agreeing on a narrative by teaching the conflicts, teaching the disagreements. This sounds superficially like a good idea and very respectful of students so they can hear all sides. And of course, the agora concept is something dear to my own heart. But in the classroom, what students conclude, and I've found this from experience, when you do this, you say, look at all these different perspectives of scholars on the Industrial Revolution. Was it good? Was it bad? Did it help the working class? Did it harm the working class? And the students come out concluding, why should I be concerned with this if you guys can't even agree among yourselves what happened? So I think it's much better to teach the American story in as straightforward a way as possible. Skip the scholars. Some scholars say this, some scholars say that. And to be as honest as you can, give the students a strong underlying sense of their heritage, and then let them generate the questions and the dissents in response to it. I'm not advocating teaching American history as a pleasing myth or some other kind of whitewash. It's essential that students know the facts about the defects and faults of the American past. But by the same token, to present American history as something relentlessly and comprehensively problematic, conflicted and contested at every point, which is the default position of most contemporary historical scholarship, I think is not only unilluminating, but it's very bad pedagogy. And it's a giant fudge, intellectually speaking. Third, the design of the courses in our curricula are and must be an exercise in triage, in making hard choices, not about what to include, but what to throw out. This is actually very obvious to anybody who teaches a survey course in any subject, that there's an infinite number of things one can include to be inclusive. But inclusiveness, which is good in some areas, is certainly not good in an effort to present students with an exciting and fresh and comprehensible approach to a subject that's new to them. The last thing we need to do is to emulate the mind of S., the addled Russian journalist who remembered everything but knew nothing. We need to be clear about our mission. We need to be willing to identify, and this is where I really get down to it, the things that every American student needs to know and insist upon them. For example, not coincidentally, an understanding of the origins and structure of the United States Constitution. And there are other things too. And pare away at the rest. Just be sure that we are good at presenting these essential and foundational things. This is almost as hard as cutting the national budget, and for some of the same reasons. Because every item that's in a history textbook is there partly because some interest group, either political or intellectual, wants it there. But it is possible. And I think we have to resolve to do that. what all three of these suggestions have in common is a renewed emphasis on having a perspective and resolve to tell the American story in a clearer and more compelling way with the selectivity that's imposed by the requirements of a strong narrative. This is, I think, the right way to proceed. We've been content for too long to say that the purpose of education is the inculcation of critical thinking and nothing else. This is an oversimplifying mantra that deserves to be retired. Now, scholars tend to go on the defensive when practical-minded people ask them about the use of their discipline. We shouldn't, and I think in the future we won't be able to get away with it. It's wrong to say the study of history needs to make itself useful in the present, and we shouldn't be embarrassed to say so. But we need to think of use in a broader way than we're accustomed to thinking of it. Part of history's use to us is the way it allows us to escape from our natural tendency to be imprisoned by the present, mentally, and to show us how and why we should acknowledge the dignity of memory and the reality and authority, even, of the past. This is a very hard sell to young people. It's a very hard sell to Americans of any age. We're practical-minded, present-minded people. But that's precisely why scholars should not allow themselves to forget that they further an important public purpose simply by doing what it is that they do, by being what they are, in preserving a longer, broader, and deeper kind of consciousness, the kind of quality of soul that our culture wars against, particularly in the present day. The cultivation of these qualities of soul are at least as important as critical thinking in the education of citizens. It means giving young people tools that allow for the fostering of loyalty. Not only loyalty to the abstract values and universal principles for which the nation stands, but also, and just as importantly, to the way that more concrete, specific, and local facts of memory, tradition, and history contribute to our sense of citizenship and place. I'm so happy to hear the essay, the second prize that went to the essay about place. That's a terrific subject. We have, in my opinion, concentrated too much on the commanding heights of ideology over the definition of America, and not enough on the need to reconsider the way that America is embodied in the habits, thoughts, and memories of her people. In other words, American patriotism has more than one source. The patriot loves America partly because it is his own country, and partly because he loves the ideals for which the country stands. The two motives are different. They're in tension sometimes, but they're also inseparable, and they're mutually indispensable. America is not a class-conscious traditional society or a blood and soil nation state. But neither is it, or should it be, the mere staging ground for a universalistic ideological crusade. This is not for a minute to argue that America can or ever should be understood without reference to normative principles. But it's worrisome to see the exclusive weight given so often to the abstract and ideological and national dimensions of American patriotism, to the virtual exclusion of all else. So, how might one arrive at a more accurate understanding of the mixed nature of American patriotism? Well, one might begin by analogy with marriage, an institution in which something very much like this twofold division of motives also obtains. The parallels are suggestive. Those of you who are married couples can ponder this. A man is devoted to his wife partly because she is admirable by both subjective and universal standards, and partly because she is his wife, that is, not property. I don't want to get in trouble here. I may already be in trouble. And it's easy to see how in a marriage one cannot separate these various things in practice. In other words, the nature of the commitment made in a good marriage is a complex blend of motives, ideal and primal, extrinsic and intrinsic, practical and impractical, objective and subjective. And it would be unthinkable, even ludicrous, to imagine one could exist without the other. There is merit in a love that's directed towards a person who has abundant, admirable qualities. But there's even more merit in a love that's able, over time, within a commitment, to acknowledge and accept, up to a point, what is less than fully admirable, what is all too human about the otherwise admirable other. One might extend this analogy to encompass other relationships within the family. If a country is like a spouse, it's also like a parent, since the country constitutes one of the primary sources of one's being. Yet Americans only rarely speak of their country as a fatherland, in the way many Europeans were wont to speak of their countries before the EU, maybe after the EU, well, again. In fact, one might say America was the land to which one came when one wanted to escape the father, either literally or figuratively. It was a country where one put aside the heavy lumber of inherited identity and tradition and was freed to begin again. Hence, G.K. Chesterton's famous saying that America, not being a fatherland, is a nation founded on a creed, a nation with the soul of a church. There's some truth in this, but it is not the whole truth of the matter. This gets back to my earlier distinction between the two different sources of patriotism. The Chestertonian analogy breaks down, or actually, it'd be better to say it tells us more than it was intended to tell. For a church is more than a creed. The creed is important. The creed is indispensable as a way of instructing the young, a handy distillation of church doctrine, a way of keeping people on track. But a church that had only a creed would be no church at all. One doesn't have to resort to the particulars of Christian theology to explain this. You only need visit an old churchyard and see the gravestones of several generations of a family clustered together to understand. All churches, even the most wildly New Agey ones, possess a rich storehouse of conscious and unconscious traditions, liturgies, songs, rituals, and customs, which over time become inseparable in the minds and hearts of the worshipers from the content of their faith. Creeds are useful, but the biblical and liturgical texts and the sacraments and the rituals are not finally reducible to propositional statements. They're not reducible to anything other than themselves. And there's a seamless web that unites every part of church life with every other, for better or worse. That's why any change in church life, take just a random example, the music. Can I hear anyone react to that? Because these changes seem to challenge the structure of the universe and rattle the bones of the dead. So a creed can be useful to shake up complacency. It has defensive uses to keep the train on track, but it is not the soul of a church or of a nation. Or to put it another way, a creed is a distillation of beliefs that are already present and grounded elsewhere. For the same reason, indoctrination into the principles of the Declaration of Independence alone will not make our young people into patriots. It is a beginning, but it's only a beginning. As both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams made clear, the Americans of the Revolutionary generation did not need instruction in what their Declaration declared. The Declaration was first and foremost a kind of press release to the world, which attempted to put into words what most Americans already believed and embodied in their way of life. For our young people to know about it is, in the end, indispensable. But what is just as needful, maybe more needful, is a recognition that there can be no meaningful patriotism in a society where most privileged young people have little knowledge of the past, little sense of connection to it, and little respect for it, frankly. So no grand program of ideological revitalization will rebuild all of what's been eroded. The universalisms of the left and the right miss the mark in important ways because they fail to give attention to what might be called the grassroots of American patriotic sentiment. George Orwell made a distinction between patriotism and nationalism. The former he took to be a strong attachment to place, to a particular place, to the place of one's origin. And the latter was a more abstract commitment. He was right to make this distinction, but the genius of the American system has been to attempt to combine the two. Balancing, that's what our federal system does, to balance the advantages of national combination against the needs of local government. When it works, when it's tried, can result in a sort of best of both worlds combination. So the American experiment, as I'm presenting it tonight, sets out to demonstrate that two divergent tendencies here being described, the abstract versus the particular, the national versus the patriotic, the cosmopolitan versus the local, the large versus the small, that these are reconcilable within the complex texture of American life. It stands to reason that patriotism should partake of this dual character. The American experiment has always asserted that something that even as national institutions and global institutions grow in power, we can ill afford to forget, and that is this: the political and moral health of the nation is grounded in habits and loyalties that are gained in local, stable and healthy local institutions. Again, I commend the paper on place. Why did it get second prize instead of first prize? That's what I want to know. No, never mind. Alexis de Tocqueville recognized this fact over a century and a half ago when he looked at New England town meetings and said, "These are to liberty what primary schools are to science. They're schools of liberty." And the framers of the Constitution, Tocqueville said, sought to infuse political life into each portion of the territory in order to provide Americans with a multitude of venues where they could be permitted and indeed required to be citizens. By giving them maximum authority within the administration of local affairs, the American system drew them into public life and made them better citizens on the national level. So it didn't undermine the nation, it strengthened the nation to have also strong and resilient local bonds and local affiliations. All of this points back again to underscore the importance of memory and historical consciousness in fostering American patriotism. We've forgotten what the study of history is for. It'd be good to remember that first. The subject of memory, for example, those of you who have majored in history, or those of you who are historians, well know what I'm talking about. The subject of memory has become fashionable over the last 20 years or so among professional historians. Usually that interest focuses around the presumption that popular memories are always wrong, always in need, desperate need of debunking, never a source of any kind of collective wisdom. The French historian Pierre Nora spoke for the profession with these words: "History is perpetually suspicious of memory, and its true mission is to suppress and destroy it." I mean, the French are given to these kinds of wild overstatements, but taking him seriously, this attitude is antithetical to civilized life. While it may stand well in the seminar room, it can't be allowed to stand for the larger public. It's too serious. The acquisition of historical consciousness is too serious a need, and it is an important moral discipline of the soul. It means learning to appropriate into our moral imaginations the distilled memories of others who experienced events that we never witnessed in times and places to which we were never privy. By an expansion of inward sympathy, we make these things our own, not merely by knowing about them, but by looking out at the world through their filter, incorporating them into our awareness, learning to see the past as an immanent presence woven into the world as it lies before us. By its very nature, historical consciousness cannot and should not become the province of an exclusive historical priesthood, because it is meant to be the common possession of all, a mortar that holds together our common life. Well, if all these good things are to come to pass, we who are the custodians of historical memory will have to take seriously its role in the shaping of the public mind and public life. It needs to be something for the agora. Again, this doesn't mean that history has to justify itself in terms of public policy usefulness. It's much more useful through the simple act insisting on the perquisites of memory, on the privileges of memory, and the reality of the past, along with our embeddedness in the past. People will not love their nation or defend it if they cease to remember what the nation is or where it came from. This kind of love and devotion flows from memory, and it involves remembering much, much more than a list of abstract universal precepts. Gratitude to one's country, however principled, must also draw on forms of gratitude that are more primary, on the things that are personal and particular and one's own. John Adams had something exemplary to say all this, and I want to close with his words. Unlike his rival Thomas Jefferson, and obviously I prefer Adams to Jefferson. I'm north of the Mason-Dixon line. When I'm south of the Mason-Dixon line, I prefer Jefferson. So that's not true. I always prefer Adams. Unlike Thomas Jefferson, Adams did not compose an epitaph for himself in anticipation of his death, nor did he design his funerary architecture and so on. But Adams did compose an inscription for the sarcophagus lid of his ancestor, Henry Adams, the first Massachusetts Adams, who had arrived in 1638. That's 8 years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony began, and nearly a century before John's birth. The inscription, and David McCullough ends his wonderful biography of John Adams with this. The inscription speaks volumes about how Adams thought of his place in history and how he accepted the obligation to instruct the future by honoring the past. And let me read it. It's just absolutely wonderful. This stone and several others have been placed in this yard by a great-great-grandson from a veneration of the piety, humility, simplicity, prudence, frugality, industry, and perseverance of his ancestors, in hopes of recommending an affirmation of their virtues to their posterity. There's a whole philosophy of history of sorts embedded in these words. Adams was no fool about the faults and perversities of the human heart. He was an expert on that subject. Self-study was enough to produce his expertise. He was also under no illusion that his forebears were perfect. Neither was he under the illusion that he or his descendants could live full and admirable lives without drawing on the things the forebears had labored to create. And we have done very well in addressing ourselves as a civilization to the first illusion, that our forebears were not perfect. We know this beyond a shadow of doubt. But in specializing, in majoring in the faults and perversities of our forebears, we have fallen in the arms of the second illusion, that one can live full and admirable lives without drawing on the resources of the forebears. Now may be the time to address that problem. And it's one of the things I see this institution, this admirable institution that is being brought into being here as doing. It's a mistake to live without criticism of the past, and I'm not advocating that by any means. But it's also a mistake to live without gratitude to the past. The fullness of our humanity demands that we do both. Thank you. That wasn't too long.
No, that was great. Do you take a couple questions?
Oh, sure.
Dr. McClay has agreed to take a couple of questions, so if you would like to raise your hand, we'll call on you. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't filled out an information card, please do so. And Drew Alexander, who is the Agora Fellow standing up in the back of the room, will be along this side of the room to collect them momentarily. And so with that, please identify yourself when you stand to ask a question. So questions?
That awkward silence. Yeah, no, they're just so stunned into silence. How could anyone talk for that long? Yes, ma'am.
You say you're not in favor of textbooks, but are you more into like a biography or a historical novel or a particular book about an incident, or all of the above?
Yeah, well, all of the above. I mean, I think it's good for students to have a sense of the varieties of ways in which you can write about and think about the past. And certainly, I think, just to give one example, I think Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is actually a much better work of fiction than people give it credit for being qua work of fiction. But it's also one of the single best books that you could read, particularly with high school age students, on slavery. And I know all of the arguments against it, you know, but in fact it's vivid. It teaches you. This is actually a particular interest of mine. It teaches you what it was specifically about the institution of slavery that was offensive to the people who were moved by that novel. And the novel had enormous influence in the North in changing the views of people who we might now call independents in the direction of anti-slavery. And it's very good for illuminating that. So it's both a historical source and a kind of historical. It's an artifact of the times, but it's also a useful window onto the times. So I think fiction, carefully selected and taught in the right way, can be more useful in teaching about the past than many nonfiction accounts. But I also want to say I think it's very important that people have students read things that draw together large periods of time. The problem I have with textbooks is that they are authored by multiple individuals. They really are commodities that are, and by the way, the dirty little secret about textbooks is that they're really not written by the people whose names are on the cover. They're written by their graduate students, or staffers at the publisher, or others, freelance people. They're confected. If you ever look at 5 or 6 American history textbooks in parallel, you discover they repeat whole sentences and paragraphs that are virtually identical. Wow, I wonder why that is. They're designed to thread their way through the politics of textbook adoption committees in some states. Which if you get your textbook adopted in Texas, you're a millionaire overnight, because your textbook goes out. But it means that things about which you have to do one of two things, and maybe both, is avoid controversial positions, and make sure you include every group that's likely to have a voice, that's likely to appear before the school board and say, there's nothing in here about Lithuanian dwarfs and their role in the silver mining economy. And so you've got to have a little sidebar about, no offense, please, to anyone. I've just picked that at random, it could have been Tennessee dwarfs, or Scotch-Irish dwarfs. How's that? But you see what I mean? That there's a way in which, talk about the sausage being made, making you lose appetite for the product. That I think is one of the complaints I have about textbooks, and they're really so market driven. And they don't reflect, and they don't reflect the vision, the understanding of a particular author. The names of the authors on the book are just, there to sell the book. But and look, some of them are more conscientious than others, and they do take a look at the sections of the textbooks for which they're responsible. I concede that. I'm making a painting with a very broad brush here. And I know some people who write textbooks who I know that they are responsible individuals. But by and large, they're confections for a kind of market in which a sort of bland inclusiveness is more important than acuity of perspective and the power of the narrative. I don't have any problem understanding why kids don't want to read textbooks. I don't want to read them. But now you put something, even a somewhat out of date work of history in their hands. Charles Beard's The Rise of American Civilization, which was published in 1929. And Beard was a professional historian. That's a very compelling read. And I would rather have somebody read that, if I had only two choices, than to read a more up-to-date textbook. Because at least they'd come away with a kind of curiosity about the American past. At least they would come away with a picture of the American past, which they might well want to dissent from or argue with, but that had some verve and vividness and cogency to it. So big books, one of my favorite books is, I can't remember his name, but it's a little book called A Child's History of the World. You know the book. Homeschoolers use it a lot because the Calvert home study system features it. It's one of the few places you can buy it. This is a great book to put in front of kids who are able to, as early as they're able to read it, because it gives them such a sense of the scope of human history and leads them to be, it was great with my kids, it leads them on to further kinds of curiosity.
We have time for one more question.
I'm sorry, I went on and on about that one, but that was a great question.
Well, is history a kind of science, a Germanic academic science, or is it an art, like literature, or is it a theology? And you don't mean this as a multiple choice question. A historian named Veronica Wedgwood said, history is an art like all the other sciences. But I think it partakes of all of those things, including theology. I mean, in the sense that the best history has to at least be willing to engage the question, well, maybe not theology, but something akin to theology. It has to at least engage the question of what is the telos, what is the end of human existence? And I don't think many historians are in a position to answer it. As a Christian, I think that they can't answer it. That the full meaning of history is not inside history. But as for being an artist, I think it has characteristics of both. It certainly is like a science in the sense that scientists concern themselves with the formulation. And I mean, it's a really admirable discipline that more historians should have. To formulate a problem clearly in a way that you can then test against the evidence. Unfortunately, historians can't conduct experiments. That's probably fortunately they can't conduct experiments. But we're dealing with a science of non-repeatable things. So, and in science, the key to upholding your hypothesis is you have to be able to replicate the experiments. That's precisely what we can't do in history. So there's no way it can ever be a science in any sort of modern sense, I mean, post-scientific revolution sense of science. It has to be empirically verifiable, and we can't do that. But we come as close as we can. There's a sense in which history, the record of the human past, is our laboratory. And it's a kind of like a crazy mad scientist lab book in which every experiment is done once. And you have to sort of draw conclusions from that. And obviously there's considerable artistry in that. There's artistry in a kind of intuitive, imaginative gift that historians have to have in order to be able to string together things that don't immediately present themselves as belonging together. To look at something in the past and see how certain things were going on at the same time within a cultural matrix that the people at the time themselves would not have seen as related, but that we, through a kind of act of imagination, can see as being related. I mean, that's one of the really fascinating things in history, is to see this way that there's a larger pattern that's real, that the individuals themselves who make up the pattern and enact the pattern can't grasp or maybe not even have an inkling of. They're in the grip of it without knowing it. Just as we are in the grip of things that we don't know and can't understand. We should be a little more humble about that we're not living in the age of ultimate truths, where our truths are just as provisional as those of every other age before us, which gets back to the theology issue.
Thank you.
This is such a